I'm NIMA Rajan, and this is Forum Daily Week in Review. A massive and colorful Pride Parade was hosted in Canada's biggest city this weekend, capping off weeks of festivities during Pride Month. However, advocates say a lot still needs to be done to address what they call the normalization of hate in Canada. Community members and the Canadian Mental Health Association say they are worried about the impact of rising levels of hate on the mental health and safety of the LGBTQ+ community. Faye Johnstone, the president of the Society of Queer Momentum, says the organization has launched a campaign calling on the federal government to help. The Society's calls to action include the appointment of a special representative on addressing hate against the LGBTQ+ community and funding to combat disinformation. Well, joining us now to tell us more about this call for help and to unpack this normalization of hate is Ms. Sarah Kennel, National Director of Public Policy at the Canadian Mental Health Association. Ms. Kennel, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Thank you for having me, and happy Pride Month.
Happy Pride Month to you too, ma'am. Now, we saw some beautiful Pride parades this weekend, but we also heard from advocates that were highlighting increasing hate crimes against the LGBTQ+ community. So what do we know so far about these increasing levels of hate crimes in Canada in particular? And do we have any numbers or stats behind this?
We do. So Stats Canada does collect research around police-reported incidents of hate against the 2S LGBTQ+ community. We know that between 2019 and 2021, incidents of police-reported hate almost doubled during that time period. So we're certainly seeing a dramatic rise, but we also know that unreported incidents of harassment, intimidation, hate, and outward acts of discrimination are on the rise anecdotally across our communities, and that's of great concern because they do carry significant mental and physical health impacts.
Some very concerning stats there, ma'am. Now, I really do want to touch on what advocates are calling the normalization of hate. So what exactly is the normalization of hate, and what does it look like in our country?
Really, we're seeing it proliferate across our country in the form of protests against school, the removal of books containing information about the 2S LGBTQ+ community from libraries. We're seeing online threats against activists within this community and the organizations that support them. And then we're also seeing, as we've been talking about, real acts of discrimination and hate against the community. And what it means is that children aren't safe and don't feel safe and welcome within schools. Individuals from the 2S LGBTQ+ community don't feel safe in their workplaces disclosing their true identity. And it creates a lot of shame and fear and stigma about living one's authentic and real identity. And that's what's of concern and really what we're seeing across the country.
Very concerning information indeed. Now, I mentioned the Society of Queer Momentum. They're calling for a special representative to address hate against the 2S LGBTQ+ community. So what is the CMHA's stance on this?
Well, certainly we support and stand behind the Queer Momentum Society and really the organizations across the country that are doing this important advocacy work. From our perspective, we really want to see greater accountability for these acts of violence, ensuring that individuals who have been harmed have the appropriate remedies and that their rights violations are addressed. And then also from a preventative perspective, what role could this position play in ensuring that resources are put to preventing this kind of hate from the first place, whether that be social and emotional learning in school to create societies and cultures of acceptance and inclusivity, also comprehensive sexuality education, so people become aware of what diverse sexual orientations and gender identities mean and how we can accept them and love them.
All right, and now just about a minute left here, but how is this rise in hate crimes and this normalization of hate currently being addressed by officials?
Yeah, we've seen, an outpouring of support from many federal officials across party lines attend pride parades and speak out in support of the 2S LGBTQ+ community. We're seeing investments in queer and trans organizations to protect their safety during Pride Month, the action plan to combat hate, the federal 2S LGBTQ+ action plan and corresponding community capacity building fund. These are all positive things. However, we need to also look at what's happening at community level and ensure that we're putting resources behind addressing some of this rising hate as we see this national leadership progress.
All right, Ms. Kennel, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thanks for having me.
All right, after the break, we're going to be discussing grocery store competition, how real estate practices may be hurting that competition, and how this impacts food prices in our country. We'll have our interview with Dr. Sylvain Charlois, director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University, up next. And after that, we'll have more important conversations from this past week, so stay with us. Canada's competition watchdog is calling for changes to a common real estate practice used by grocers to limit competition. It involves a grocer adding a special clause to a lease or deed, sometimes called a restrictive covenant. Now, this limits the kind of store that can open at that location after the grocer leaves the property. In a report on the country's retail grocery sector, the Competition Bureau says that these restrictive clauses curb competition and that they make it harder for new supermarkets to open. It recommends that governments take measures to limit property controls in the grocery industry, including banning their use. Well, joining us now to discuss the report and these real estate practices is Dr. Sylvain Charlois, director of the Agri-Food Analytics Lab at Dalhousie University. Dr. Charlois, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Well, thank you.
Now, the Competition Bureau is suggesting that real estate practices are limiting competition, as we mentioned. But how big of an issue is this in the Canadian market? And would it be appropriate for the government to enact a legislation to prevent these special clauses?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The report itself actually highlights something that most of us didn't know. I knew that that grocers can get very territorial in several towns across the country, but being territorial means that some grocers were pushing back competition. And so what is underscored by the report is that all levels of government need to get involved here, including municipalities, and that's where the game plays when you actually have leases negotiated. Sometimes you even have grocers buying several lots to make sure that the competition doesn't build another grocery store across the street, for example. So those practices were condemned by the report. Essentially, what the Competition Bureau is saying is, I think some people need to ask more questions when grocers tend to be too territorial.
And how's this sort of limited competition impacting the overall rate of food inflation? Are there some other factors at play that may be causing this rise in food prices?
Well, it's hard to measure how this tactic, I guess, would impact food inflation, but one can argue that it does actually impact food prices very locally. It's a very localized way of affecting, modifying market conditions. Really, as soon as you actually get rid of one grocery store, you will see the influence. And it's the same the other way around. The Walmart effect we've seen over several decades in Canada is actually real. Whenever there was a Walmart that opened up in a small town, and that's what the strategy was all about for Walmart, to go into cities of 15 to 30,000, you saw a drop in food prices over time. But that effect is long gone. And that's why the Bureau is looking at making Canada more attractive for external investors like Aldi and Lidl, German grocers, which have been in the U.S. for a while now.
And I really came across something quite interesting. Advocates are saying that this real estate practice can create something called a food desert or contribute to food insecurity in Canada. So, are these issues currently present in our country? And if so, what do these food deserts look like?
Actually, it's absolutely true. I would call it more of a food monopoly, a localized monopoly, if you will, because the desert is basically a small urban market where there is no option at all, no affordable option. So yes, it can be a contributing factor for urban deserts, but people will have access to food. It's just maybe prices may be more inflated. The more players you bring into the market, the more likely you'll see prices drop. But there are limitations. I mean, they you can actually make food inflation less of an issue, um, but there are limits to that. So we have to be careful here. I mean, there are some oligopolies in Canada with only two players. We have five, so it's not that bad. The challenge that we have in Canada when it comes to food distribution is that we have some players abusing of their power.
And on that note, we know that Ottawa is claiming that price gouging is the root cause of food inflation. What are your thoughts on that, Dr. Charlebois? Just a quick 30 seconds left here.
Well, the House of Commons committee actually did not say that there was gouging. They couldn't actually demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt, and they were waiting for the bureau to state their case on the issue, and there was nothing in the report yesterday. What's really missing in the report, I think, is that the bureau failed to address the big elephant in the room, and that's price fixing. Price fixing is a problem in the industry right now.
All right, Dr. Charlebois, lots to keep our eyes on. Again, we really appreciate your time today.
Take care.
All right, coming up, we'll be diving into Toronto's mayoral race. Our interview with Dr. Lydia Miljan from the University of Windsor is up next. Toronto has a new mayor-elect, as Olivia Chow heads to City Hall today after eking out a win in a by-election against 101 other candidates. The election results are set to be certified by the city clerk tomorrow, with a swear-in date yet to be announced. Clerk John Elvidge says Ms. Chow has requested to take office on July 12th, subject to the certification of the official results. Her win comes after a lot of criticism from Ontario Premier Doug Ford, who said that Ms. Chow would be an unmitigated disaster as a mayor. But today it was a different tone coming from Mr. Ford, who claims that the two will find common ground. All this comes amid the backdrop of Toronto's nearly $1 billion pandemic-related budget shortfall. Well, joining us now to talk more on the election of Olivia Chow as mayor of Canada's biggest city is Dr. Lydia Miljan, political science professor at the University of Windsor. Ms. Miljan, thank you again for your time today.
My pleasure, Nima.
So as we mentioned, this election had over 100 candidates and over 10 high-profile names on that list. How did this giant number of candidates impact the election results? And what does this say about the state of Toronto politics overall? Is this a good thing for democracy?
Well, actually, surprisingly, the voter turnout went up compared with the 2022 general election. I think quite significantly by about 9 percentage points. And I think that was in part because there were so many candidates and it was focused on just the mayor's race. But ironically, it ended up that because of that abundance of candidates, that Olivia Chow actually got the lowest number of votes of any mayor in Toronto's history. So she has actually a weaker mandate than what John Tory had, even though John Tory had a lower voter turnout. So it's one of those weird ironies about the math. But, I think in general, it means that, at least for Toronto, there's a robust discussion about democracy, and that people, when they're given an open election and that the results aren't a foregone conclusion, that they will be motivated to come out and vote.
And the election of Ms. Chow, it's quite the political shift for Torontonians, considering previous more conservative leading mayors, Rob Ford, John Tory. So what is the significance of this sort of political shift in Toronto?
Well, that still remains to be seen. I mean, council itself tends to be a little bit left of center. And even you could suggest that John Tory wasn't exactly, a very strong conservative. I think he might be more in the progressive conservative part of that political party. But nonetheless, this is a shift to the left. And it does mean that, some of her campaign promises, as vague as they were, might be coming to people's pocketbooks. I mean, she did say that she was going to increase taxes. She didn't claim how much that was going to be, and certainly she's hoping to put that increase in tax revenue towards more services, towards transit, towards housing. The extent to which she's able to do that, given that budget shortfall, remains to be seen, but that is the direction that she has signaled she wants to go, and obviously that's the direction that at least more people voted for than against in terms of her win.
We'll definitely have to see whether those promises are maintained or delivered on. Now, Ms. Chow maintained her lead in popularity among voters, even amid a lot of pushback. We had Doug Ford's support of Mark Saunders and John Tory's push for Anna Bailão. What was it about Ms. Chow's campaign that really stood strong amid all of this pushback?
I mean, it certainly wasn't an easy win for her, and she was severely, challenged by, especially Anna Bailão. I think that John Tory's endorsement of her really made that a two-person race. And when there was some points during the election night that actually looked like Anna Bailão might have won. She was ahead in early poll results. But I think what it suggests is that name recognition really matters. I think that Olivia Chow did have the strongest name recognition. And I think she also had quite a lot of support from her NDP colleagues. And that is exceptionally important in election campaigns, to be able to get volunteers out, to be able to put those signs up, to knock on doors, and effectively to get the vote out. So obviously her machine, her ability to do that was much superior to that of the other candidates. And I think that's a good indication of why she had won last night.
All right, Dr. Miljohn, just about 45 seconds left, but what do you see as being the major challenges for Ms. Chow moving forward?
Well, obviously, infrastructure is going to be a big one. Housing, cost of living, transportation. Those are the key ones. But then there's the whole sort of social conditions of Toronto, the unhoused, the fact that we do have an opioid crisis throughout the country, and figuring out a way to pay for it. I mean, she can't put it on the backs of Torontonians simply because she doesn't have that much time. By the time she raises taxes, she only has 2 years, and people's memories will be pretty sharp. And so she's going to really be struggling to find the way to pay for it. She's going to go to the province, she's going to go to the federal government and hope that they can help her out.
Lots to keep our eyes on. Dr. Miljohn, thank you again for your time today on Forum Daily.
My pleasure, Nima.
We'll be right back after a short commercial break. Two of Canada's top regulatory bodies in the investment space have amalgamated and have renamed themselves the Canadian Investment Regulatory Organization, or the CIRO. The name change follows the merger of the Investment Industry Regulatory Organization of Canada and the Mutual Fund Dealers Association of Canada earlier this year. The newly named CIRO is the national self-regulatory organization that oversees all investment dealers, mutual fund dealers, and trading activity on Canada's debt and equity marketplaces. Well, joining us now to discuss this move and what it means for investors is Brendan Caldwell, Director of Caldwell Securities Limited. Brendan, welcome back to Forum Daily.
Always great to be here, and happy Canada Day weekend.
Happy Canada Day. Now, could you tell us a little bit more about the IIROC and the MFDA and what this merger and renaming to the Canadian Investment Regulatory Organization means?
Well, with all that, I'll try not to make it too inside baseball, so to speak. What could be more Canadian than the National Regulatory Organization for the Investment Industry? Well, there were really two groups that regulated people who sold investments to the public. One was for securities dealers that sold stocks and bonds and mutual funds and everything else. That was IIROC, the Independent Investment Regulatory Organization of Canada. And the other was a group that just looked after mutual funds and did a lot more in the way of financial planning, normally speaking, where the stockbrokers, the members of IIROC were, well, more of that historically, although more financial planning and investment management's crept into the business over the last few decades. Historically, it was more about the trading of stock, whereas mutual fund dealers were more about financial planning and mutual fund sales. Well, the two groups have merged into this one organization, the Canadian Independent Regulatory Organization. And the idea being is that under one corporate umbrella, the financial planning, mutual fund, that type of business, and the securities trading, stock trading, exchange traded funds could all be offered under one umbrella. Hopefully it makes it simpler for the industry. And after that alphabet soup of an explanation, hopefully it's a little easier for the general public to understand too.
All right, Brendan, now in terms of the ease for companies, how does this change to dual registration affect current organizations?
Well, historically, you could either be one or the other. You could either be an investment firm, a securities firm, a member of IIROC, or you could be a mutual fund dealer. And they both had different ways of going about doing the practice. Among other things, I think one of the more significant things is that securities dealers actually hang on to the cash. Directly or indirectly, they would act as custodians and would be responsible for their clients' cash and investments. It's not that the clients were creditors, but the money would actually pass through the brokerage firm on the way to buying a stock or a bond or a mutual fund. Different for a mutual fund dealer, where they are more about recommending, doing financial planning, and they never actually, normally speaking, hung on to the money. So the money would go to one of the mutual fund companies from there. So making the two organizations into one will have some challenges. I think particularly for the mutual fund side, but also for the brokerage side, because the two cultures are very different, and the merger of cultures can be a challenge at the best of times.
All right, Brendan, and really narrowing it down to current investment dealers and mutual fund dealers themselves, how is this umbrella organization going to be impacting them in particular?
Well, in a way, yes, it makes sense and it'll be good. On the other hand, I'm a little sad to see, although I've never been a mutual fund dealer, I have worked for a major mutual fund company, and our firm offers mutual funds as well. I will be sad to see the mutual fund dealers go as a separate organization, because I think it does speak to the general pressure that is on the mutual fund business. It is not the growing, dynamic, leading edge part of the investment business it was in the 80s and 90s, which is a bit of a shame, because I do still think that they are spectacular products for the large majority of investors, specifically because they allow for the monthly contribution, the dollar cost averaging into a vehicle that's ideally designed to take that. And I think the vast majority of people, myself included, that's the best way to save, is through a mutual fund. And I would hate to see mutual funds disappear as a way of helping people accumulate wealth.
Well, we'll definitely have to see how the CIRO continues to operate. Brendan, thank you again for joining us today on Forum Daily.
Thank you, Nima.
All right, I'm NIMA RAJAN, and that'll do it for your look at important conversations from this past week. Remember, for more news on demand, you could always visit our website, thenewsforum.ca, and follow us on our social media handles for updates. Thanks again for joining us on Forum Daily Week in Review, and have a great weekend, Canada.